I'm Janice Campbell, class of 61, and I live in Oakland. And this is our first chorus talk. And we came up with the name. We had some other suggestions, but that sounded the most odd, I think. And we're going to have more. And we would love to have people talk about things that they're interested in. So if you yourself want to talk, or if you have friends, or if you know somebody else who's an Antioch alum who might be a good speaker, you can get in touch with me or get in touch with Jesse or Ellen and tell them that you're interested, and we will be in touch with you. We have a couple more talks possibly planned, but they're a secret until we do them, and some other events as well. We thought that we would brighten up the COVID periods while everyone's sitting around doing Zoom by doing another Zoom. But a Zoom with your friends and fellow classmates. So anyway, David volunteered to be our first speaker. And as you saw in the announcement for this talk, he has 44 years of finance experience in biopharma and high-tech companies. And he'll talk a little about his experience, of course, when he's talking. But there were some things that he did not say, which we think might lead you to consider his talk in various other ways. David was the chief of Maples when he was at Antioch, and he had several interesting co-op jobs. His first co-op job was interviewing high school drug dealers, and his third co-op job was at the National Institute of Health, where the government infused him with THC to study how marijuana is metabolized. And they also introduced him to inhale nitrous oxide. So when he talks, you can think if any of that has the residual effect. So David's going to talk for about 45 minutes. If you have questions that you think of as he's talking, down at the bottom of your screen, there's the chat section. So in the chat section, put in your question and we'll ask the questions when he's finished talking. If they're really long questions, or if you aren't sure you want to exactly put that in, when we finish the questions that people have written down, we'll just open up, depending on the time, we'll open it up to everybody, and you can have more of a discussion. So what else do I have to say? Yeah, that's it. Okay, so 45 minutes, and David, take it away.
Thank you. And for the benefit of my mother who's on here, not all my co-op jobs were drug related. I did help build the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, as well as the Navajo Coal Haul Railroad in Arizona. So those are maybe stories for another day. Today, I wanted to present on a topic that I'm calling Business Apocalypse, Reinventing Business for the 21st Century. And it's an area I got interested in after I retired from my last company. I think we are really on the cusp of a major transformational historical period for businesses. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about why I think that's the case and where I think businesses are going today. So let me start first by talking a little bit about the last company I worked for. And let me pull up. Oops, okay. Okay. So the last company I worked for was called Alumni Pharmaceuticals, and it was a small biotech startup. And I think as I talk a little bit about how the company grew, you'll see parallels to your experiences probably with companies in the business world. I started there in 2008. There were 4 employees at the time. They were all scientists. And over the next 10 years, we grew to the large number of 18 people. And we had about 9 contract people that were spread across the country. Now, during that period, based on my 30 years of prior experience, we put a number of policies into place. One was a spending approval policy that basically said, you know, the CEO could spend up to so much money before he needed board approval. Vice presidents could spend up to X, managers some less than that, and so on and so forth. We also put in place a travel and expense policy that dictated when it was okay for employees to fly business class rather than coach, what kind of class of hotel we expected them to stay at, what kind of meal allowances basically we expected. And we audited all the expense reports that came in to make sure that people followed those guidelines. And at one point when the CEO felt that the clinical people were spending too much time working from home, we put together a policy of core working hours that said people should be in the company premises between about 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Those are kind of a sample of policies and procedures that you might sort of be familiar with if you have companies of any sort. The other thing we did was pretty typical. At the beginning of the year, the senior management group would get together and put together a list of corporate objectives that we felt would be good for the company going forward. Those would be reviewed by the board of directors and either changed or approved. And then we'd ripple those down to each individual person's, you know, performance plans for the upcoming year. At the end of the year, we do performance reviews where everybody would, you know, sit down with their manager, take a look at their objectives, see if they had accomplished them or not, and then those got tied into compensation bonuses and merit increases and things of that nature. All fairly typical, I think, processes for at least the companies I grew up with, and I suspect familiar to most people. Well, in the last 2 years of my being at Alumni, before we shut the company down, this felt less and less satisfactory, this process. It seemed that the goals, by the time you got to the end of the year, were very different from the goals that you had started with at the beginning of the year. And maybe you did an update in 6 months, in June, but even so, by the end of the year, maybe not so much what you were really doing. Performance reviews, everybody really hated. Not the people getting reviewed, nor the managers giving them. And so that was unsatisfactory. And then the compensation, it seems like performance reviews were mostly a way to justify the compensation decisions once people were sort of ranked and bonuses approved and so on and so forth. So once I retired, I thought, well, let me look around and see if some other companies are handling this better, because none of this seems to be working very well. And what I found was that the practices we were following really dated back almost a century to the beginning of the 20th century. So let me make this a little smaller. So if you go back, in 1911, there was a fellow named Frederick Winslow Taylor who published a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. And if you've had a management course, you might have run into Taylor before. His book was voted the most influential management book of the 20th century by a group called the Academy of Management. And what Taylor was an engineer. And he sought to bring scientific method to how factory floors operated. And he's known for time and motion studies of going down to the factory floor with his stopwatch and watching people perform different tasks and timing them and then trying to figure out how to make them efficient. Well, from that sort of evolved the separation of management and labor. So management became responsible for basically oversight and supervising tasks and laying out the particular prescriptions for how these tasks were supposed to operate on the factory floor. And labor basically got the job of doing the tasks according to very scripted procedures. This also sort of led to the creation of our hierarchical command and control structures, which, you know, you're used to seeing in terms of the senior level, C-level suite with, you know, CEO and chief technical officer and so on, then filtering down to vice presidents and directors and managers. And this also then created an information flow that basically went up and down the organization. And lastly, there was the assumption that the activities that people performed needed to be carefully scripted, and that your conformance to those would get rewarded or punished based on, you know, what you were paid or your bonuses and things like that. And all of those kind of assumptions have worked their way down into our work world today. Well, the question is, why doesn't that work today? What's changed? And I mean, I could tell from my company it didn't seem to really work for us. And I think more and more other companies are finding, sort of coming to that same conclusion. So then I stood back and I said, okay, so what are the conditions that businesses operate in now that make these things no longer really workable? And I put together here essentially 6 trends that I see happening in the business world that I think are changing why these things don't work. So if we start at the top, just the accelerating rate of technological change. Science and technology is moving very quickly. It's harder and harder to keep track of everything that's happening. And I think to understand how that's sort of a proxy on that trend, we can take a look at this chart here. So this chart shows the annual patent applications as collected by the World Bank. And if you look at 1988, which is a very tiny little number down there on the third number down there, you can see that 500,000 patent applications were submitted that year. It took 19 years for the number of patent applications to double to 1 million applications a year. It's only taken 9 years to double again to 2 million applications. So you've got an exponential curve going on here, and there's no reason to think that it's going to, you know, level off or decline. So there's a lot of things to try and keep track of. The next hexagon, as we move to the right clockwise, is internet connectivity and globalization. The internet's been with us for a while, but what it has done is really made kind of the whole world an operating stage. It has decreased the cost of distance. It means you can employ people anywhere around the world where you find the most talent that you can use. It's led to globalization. It's led to international supply chains. Essentially, it's had a big difference. And a lot of it has been realized, I think, at this point. But now that the pandemic's hit, you can see some of the more interesting aspects of it in terms of people working remotely, for example. So then we move down to artificial intelligence, robotics, data acquisition, and analysis. You know, for about 50 or 60 years, it seems like science fiction writers have been talking about how robots are going to replace humans. And it really hasn't happened. But we are now sort of at more of the beginning of when that revolution is really going to take place. Within robotics, well, you have vision systems that are now being developed that can be used, for example, by cars to self-drive themselves. You have the collection of large amounts of data combined with artificial intelligence and machine learning that is getting more and more powerful in terms of being able to dictate how computers can control and respond to humans in different ways. So then if we move down to the bottom hexagon, the growth of the contract and gig workforce. The estimate is that the workforce, 13 to 36% of the workforce is now made up of contract and gig workers. That depends on the definition you use, whether you're talking about people that basically are full-time gig workers or people that have a regular job and supplement their work with sort of an outside project or two. The has helped this happen because it's made a marketplace for buyers and sellers, and the movement of the economy to service work makes this much more possible because you know, Uber drivers and stuff is all basically service work. If we move next to the generational transformation of the workforce, there's 3 items here that are worth noting. The first is that you have a generation transfer. You have people who are baby boomers leaving the workforce, and you have Gen Z people and the millennials who are entering the workforce. And these people have grown up in a much different environment than the baby boomers did. There have been studies that indicate of the millennials and the Gen Zers that they have a much different outlook, a different way of working, and that companies need to sort of adapt to that, the fact that they grew up in a much different environment and they have different expectations. A second transformation here has to do with women in the workforce. For the last decade or two, the percentage of men and the percentage of women have been about roughly equal in terms of participation. But what you found is that most recently, when you look at the achievement of various college degrees, whether you're talking associate or doctorate, women are actually participating more and getting more college degrees than men. In 2013, for every 100 men that got some kind of college certification, there were 140 women. And that's true at every level. And the third item here, I can't remember what it was. Oh yeah, is the increasing diversity of the workforce. And we can illustrate that with this chart here. So over the last decade, between 2012 and 2022 is an estimate. This chart shows the number of people by ethnic background who are entering and leaving the workforce. And the top two rows are basically white, non-Hispanic males and females. If you look at the last column, for the people leaving the workforce, 75% of them are non-Hispanic white. Only 25% are essentially Hispanic, Black, or Asians. If you look at the middle column and you look at the people entering the workforce, in that decade, basically 51% were white, 49% are non-white or Hispanic. And if you project out to 2025, 2030, the percentage of non-whites entering the workforce grows percentage-wise, becomes the majority plus. So it's kind of no wonder that companies are starting to struggle a little bit with this whole idea of diversity and inclusion, because their workforce is changing dramatically at the entering point. So lastly, we come up to the changing nature of jobs. And what we find here is a couple things. One, you've got an economy that's transitioning from manufacturing to service jobs. Service jobs involve more people-to-people interaction generally. You find that artificial intelligence and computer applications are going to start taking over the essentially boring, routine, rote jobs that people are involved in. And the rate of change means that knowledge is becoming obsolete fairly rapidly. So all of these things depress the demand for essentially what are knowledge-based skills. And what's called for are more analytical reasoning, complex problem solving, collaboration and communication, which are skills that people have over computers basically. So you take all of those elements of trends and they create a very complex environment, and not one that's well suited to the kind of structures and skills that businesses were looking for when you were predominantly a manufacturing kind of organization. So what isn't working now? Well, hierarchical management structures. They're too slow to respond to new problems. Detailed policies and procedure guidelines. Too restrictive, inflexible, they don't change to address new things as they come up. The whole idea of extrinsic rewards, in other words, what the managers dole out to their employees, that's focused on individuals, because there's a growing importance of teams in terms of accomplishing tasks, and diversity is being recognized as being an important contributor to creativity. So all of these become more group-oriented kinds of things and looking at the composition of groups over individuals. And lastly, we come back to the assumptions that came out of Taylor's work, that people are mainly motivated to work for money or to keep job security, and the kind of rewards that companies structure that in fact play to that assumption. That people would rather be directed and follow rules than accept responsibility for what they're doing, and that they'd rather not work if they could avoid it. So basically, these structures and assumptions create a working environment, and environments sort of shape how people work in those environments. And the net result is basically they're not really working in a 21st century world. So what can companies do to address these changes? And probably the first thing we need to look at is, what do companies need to look like to be able to work in this kind of world efficiently and effectively? So I've listed the external business conditions off on the left, and I've drawn arrows off to characteristics that companies basically will need to develop or are hopefully developing now. Some of these come out of the work that business consultants like Accenture and Deloitte, the kind of programs that they're marketing to companies because they see a need for it, and companies are starting to recognize that they have some deficiencies in these areas. So the first item in the column on the right is surveillance. When you have technology and science moving as fast as they do, your company really needs to have everybody who touches the outside world looking for what kind of threats might show up on the horizon. It's not just your strategic marketing group now that you can depend on to tell you where the company should go. You really need to think about your scientists that are at technical conferences. You need to think about your customer service people that are in contact with your customers and problems that they might be reporting. You need to look at your salespeople who are out there competing against other things, other corporations. One of the things here is, in the old days, your competition might have come from, Joe Floyd down the street who was selling clothes like you were selling or something along those lines. But now your competition can come from the other coast. It can come internationally from somewhere offshore. It can come from a disruptive technology. Basically, there are a lot more threats out there, and companies need to structure themselves to be able to keep track of potential changes in the environment. Operational speed, things have sped up. Companies need to be able to speed up too. Jeff Bezos, in his 2017 letter to Amazon shareholders, said that in the old days, senior management used to be able to make decisions with about 90% of the information that they wanted or needed. Now it's probably closer to 70%. And that if you're fast on your feet, the cost of being slow to make a decision was probably greater than making the wrong decision and being able to pivot in place and go a different direction. The next item of agility and flexibility. Agility has been kind of a buzzword for the consulting firms for a little while. But the way I look at it is, it's basically, how do you structure your company to be able to respond quickly? It's not just a speed issue, it's more of a structural issue. And how you move people around to create task forces that can address issues as they come up. This next item of reimagining processes around AI and humans is kind of interesting. Some companies have implemented a strategy around robotics, for example, of looking at tasks and replacing, say, somebody on the assembly line with a robot because the robot has, greater strength capability and can do the job better. The business consultants are saying, you get a little payback from that, but what's more important is to think about your processes from end to end and reimagine how it is that you have a people component to that and an artificial intelligence component to that, and how you put those two together to be most efficient in terms of the process. And the great rewards will come from approaching AI that way than looking at it in terms of replacing an individual task or two. And then lastly, we get to this idea of creating a learning organization. The way to think about this is a lot of companies, if you try something and fail, you get penalized for it. The new approach for companies that are sort of on the leading edge of this is more that, you know, failure is a component of learning. And if you're going to create an organization that moves fast and can learn, and we go back to sort of Facebook's phrase, fail fast, what you really want to do is create experiments so that if you fail going one way, you can pivot and go a different direction, and to try and set that up front before you start on a certain path. But that's going to be an important component, and it kind of changes how companies, they need to think about failure as a component of this process and not as if you fail, you get penalized, because that keeps people from actually moving forward appropriately. So in order to develop these organizational characteristics, two things are needed. You need first to be able to change organizational structure, and you need to be able to change organizational culture. So let's talk about structure first. What's required? Well, first, hierarchical management structures need to be replaced with network structures. Companies that have done this generally have open information flow. So information is shared both vertically from bottom to top of an organization, as well as across functional groups horizontally. And I'll show you a couple examples of that a little later here. Reward systems. You know, right now, most companies' reward systems are built around extrinsic rewards, about bonuses and compensation. But really what they need to be doing is thinking about how to motivate their people to essentially be proud of the work they're doing and to create internal rewards, intrinsic rewards, as opposed to just the extrinsic ones. Develop policies to facilitate the formation and dissolution of ad hoc interdisciplinary teams. More work is being done by teams, and companies need to start thinking about how they reward and organize teams. Your project leader on a team may know more about how you're doing in terms of your work than your functional manager that you presumably report to. So companies need to think about this in terms of their structures and how they can accommodate that and make that work. And lastly, where you have companies that are more diverse, have more remote located employees or contractors for that matter, and a mix of employees and contractors, companies need to think about how you create a cohesive culture to bind all those people together, to make them part of the mission, which is something they haven't really had to do before when employees were pretty much centralized in one location. So now we move to culture. What's needed on the cultural side? And here is our Antioch connection. Douglas McGregor wrote a book in 1960 called The Human Side of Enterprise. As you may or may not know, probably know, McGregor was Antioch College president between 1948 and 1954. The same group that voted Taylor's book as the most influential book voted McGregor's book as the fourth most influential management book of the 20th century. And McGregor hypothesized two theories of motivation. The first one was Theories X, which basically said people were motivated by external rewards. So this gets back to Frederick's assumptions about, you know, bonuses and punishment for activities that people were doing. And that was the only reason people actually did anything, was because they were getting rewards or punished for not doing it. His countervailing theory was Theory Y, which was based on a more intrinsic or internal based motivation. He was a contemporary of Abraham Maslow. So this kind of fits into Maslow's hierarchy of needs idea, that people need to work for their sort of self-image, and they can be self-motivated under the right conditions. that they in fact can direct themselves and take responsibility when they're aligned with a particular mission, that they can be creative, they're not just following rules, and that you can build intrinsic rewards if you give people feedback on their progress, on their accomplishments. Pride in craftsmanship and new learning can all be powerful motivators of behavior. Basically empowering the individual, which is something that wasn't true in the Taylor system. So where are we today? When I look around and say, okay, how are we doing in this? And this transition, I think current business conditions are pushing organizations from a theory X to a theory Y based culture. That many companies are in a difficult space of transitioning between the two in a fragmented way, that they don't really understand how this all fits together. You find companies like Google, Netflix, and Facebook are leading the way. And I think they're the canaries in the coal mine because they are most subject to the trends as they're happening right now. They're technology companies. Speed is critical to their fulfilling their mission. And generationally, they tend to have younger founders and younger management and younger people working at them, which I think is also pushing this. You're also seeing that entrepreneurs and venture capitalists are starting to recognize that there are new opportunities in this area. The whole idea of performance management has moved from how did you do on your objectives going backwards to how can we coach you to improve your performance going forward, not only for your career, but also for the company itself. And so it's not just a one-time deal at the end of the year tied to compensation. It's more, let's give you feedback throughout the year. And the software that's available to do this now, when you input the kind of reviews and career suggestions and whatever for people, it will give you back suggestions on how to improve certain areas to the manager to help the employee. You also find that there's software being introduced now around a topic called employee engagement, which is basically how intrinsically motivated the people working at your company. In turn also does the same thing. They send out surveys, they will ask questions to try and get at sort of the level of intrinsic motivation employees, and then they'll make suggestions on how to improve their ratings on those kinds of surveys. So let me give you some examples of how I see companies now trying to implement these theory-wide cultural ideas. And we can start with Google. This whole idea of open information flow. Google's process for setting goals when Larry Page was CEO or whichever position he had, he would agree with the board of directors each quarter on a list of corporate goals. They would publish those to the whole company, and everyone in the company would then align their goals for that quarter, which would be published along with their name and their telephone number in a directory, basically available to everybody in the company. Anybody who was not completely aligned with, where they were going, it was easily apparent by looking at their objectives, and discussions would be had and people would be brought into line. The advantage of this is, one, it's happening quarterly, so you've got a much better feedback loop happening faster, and everybody's aligned, so it's a quick process. It's not like, filtering stuff up to the board, getting board approval, filtering it all down, and then having it, everybody basically having these long discussions about how to do it. Another good example of having an open, basically, information flow, we can find an example of what happened at Facebook. So a couple of years ago, Mark Zuckerberg sent a memo out to every employee, and the subject line was, "You're fired." It caught a lot of people's attention. And then the gist of the memo was that Facebook had been working on a proprietary product that had been leaked out to the press. And in Mark's memo, he said, "I've created this company with essentially open information. I want to keep the company that way. obviously we have a person here who, you know, doesn't respect that. You know who you are, you should resign tomorrow, because we're going to investigate, we're going to find out who you are, and we're going to fire you, because I'm not changing the company to, you know, to deal with one bad apple. You know, you need to be gone. In every X culture is basically what would have happened is senior management would have said, you know, we just can't trust these people with this information, so we're going to start siloing it and, you know, keeping people from seeing stuff. And that's not really the theory Y culture these days. And so I think Zuckerberg's memo is a good example of, we're not changing the culture and we're creating a culture that's different than what it has been in the past. There's an interesting example at Netflix. So I talked a little bit about the policies that we had at Alumni, and I had a 12-page travel and entertainment policy there. Netflix took a different tact to addressing travel and entertainment costs. They're known for having published what's called the Netflix Culture Deck. And what it was an explanation of Netflix culture in a PowerPoint presentation that they would give to people either interviewing a job or people they were thinking of hiring. And it explained that Netflix culture was not like any other culture that they had probably worked at, that they would be given a lot more responsibility. And if after reading the deck, they decided that it wasn't the kind of place they wanted to work, then that was fine, but that they should know what they were getting into. So in the culture deck, Netflix approach to travel and entertainment expenses was, we expect you to treat the company's money as though it's your own. That was it. That replaces the 12 pages of guidelines that I had. So I imagine managers would review expense reports, but she says, Cord said, who was the chief technical officer, said that, you know, there may be a case where you needed to fly business. It made sense to fly business over coach. Fine, we're not going to question that. You know, that's your responsibility to make that decision. But clearly, if somebody looked like they were sort of violating the guideline of treating the company's money as their own, they would eventually get called on the carpet about it. And, you know, maybe they decide to leave or maybe they follow the guidelines. But much different approach than the way we had tried to, you know, cover every single potential possibility. Compensation. Now, if any of you have been in HR, you probably know that at the beginning of the year when salaries are set and people are looking at merit increases, companies usually go to outside salary surveys, Radford or something along those lines. And they try and keep people sort of within certain ranges that are accepted. Well, Patty McCord talks about a situation at Netflix where a director came to her office on a Friday afternoon and said, I have this manager who's working in a very critical area who has gotten an offer from Google at 50% more than we're paying him. I would like to match that. And Patty McCord gave what at the time was a fairly typical HR answer, which is, you know, we set these salaries based on annual salary surveys. We don't want to be held hostage by employees who, you know, get offers and then come and try and get us to match them. And so, no, I don't think we're going to do that. And then she went home that night and gave it some thought over the weekend. And she came to a different conclusion. She thought, okay, let's see, this manager is working in an area that's critical to Netflix's future. They've been working at it 6 to 9 months, and so they've got that much more experience. If we have to replace them, it's going to take somebody 6 months to come up to speed to where they were, and by then they're going to be 6 months behind where Google is. So, gee, maybe it makes sense we should match this offer because that's the market rate now for a person with this background and this experience. And so she went back Monday and called the director and said, you know what, we'll match it. And not only that, but we should give everybody else in the group a raise too. Very different way of thinking, and there are not many HR people even today who probably think that way. And then this last item of separating performance management from compensation. Companies are trying to do that, like, well, one, by making performance management a full year kind of activity and not a at the end of the year gotcha kind of thing. And also by separating out when the end of the year comes from when maybe you have a final performance management review and when compensation is actually decided and doled out to people. So I think you get a sense of how much different a theory X from a theory Y culture is from some of these examples. So then the question becomes, what kind of cultural change do companies need to make? And my last slide here, which kind of has some more arrows in it that maybe is a little confusing, but essentially the last column, I think, dictates where companies need to go. First, adopting diversity and inclusion practices. Some companies are starting to get this. Some companies have been working on it for a couple of years now. There still seems to be a lot of work here. And it's clear that from the diversity of entering workforce, that companies are going to need to grapple with this a lot more. One way I've heard sort of this explained is, in the past, when people hired people, they would talk about hiring somebody for fit, which generally sort of meant somebody who looked like you or whoever else was working at the company. The better way to look at that these days is hiring for addition, hiring for a different viewpoint, for somebody who's going to complement the group as opposed to somebody that's going to be the same as the group. Dropping down to the next item, building reward structures around intrinsic motivation. There's a lot of structural kind of pieces that companies need to put together to make this work, because it's very different than the way a lot of companies have thought in the past. Management and staff relationships, rather than a control, monitor, direct, companies are moving more towards a collaborate, a leadership based not on telling people what to do, but more on sort of setting a direction and helping people get there. We moved down to the transitioning from individual team orientation. I think I've talked a little bit about that already. And lastly, redefining roles and responsibilities of the individual. Basically, you're expecting a lot more responsibility from people. And if you create the environment that, you know, allows people responsibility, then they'll step up to the task. And that's kind of a different from what was done in the past. So, summary and conclusions, I would say that basically external conditions are driving organizations towards theory Y cultures. That many companies have sort of an intuitive sense of this, but I don't think they fully embrace the cultural changes. And I think they're restrained by all this overhang of traditional residual theory X assumptions that people have operated under for a very long time now. And people like me who grew up with those structures basically in the companies we worked in. I think the changes are occurring piecemeal. Parts of them are being picked up as the experience of the early adopters diffused to the workplace. You've got people like Eric Schmidt writing books about the Google way. Leslie Bach, who was the HR person at Google, has written a book. You've got the book from Netflix called Power by Patty McCord. And I think also you're starting to see some of these things presented at HR conferences that people go to. And so you're starting to see it, but I don't think there's a kind of a holistic, here's what you could do kind of thing. And when you change cultures, it's not an easy thing to do. And finally, I think the response to COVID-19 has accelerated the transition a little bit. You go from my CEO, who was concerned that people were working from home too much, to an environment now where everybody's working from home, basically, unless they're a service first responder or, you know, in a grocery store, basically. So I think that's pushing companies more towards having to accept some of these assumptions that they didn't have to before. And that's basically it. That's my thinking on this situation. So we'll take questions and comments here.
can I ask you one, David?
Yes, you may.
Mia? I am not someone who can react to it really fast and come up with, I've got the greatest question for you, because I really want to think about this some. But right off the bat, from the young people I know, which would be young, meaning, 45 years old and younger, including my children and their spouses and their friends, I think that they realize so well that their lives, we used to say, like when I was growing up, my father was never mixed business with pleasure, right? You worked and then you went home and you had your social life, no mixing. And I think people now realize so much that that is their life. When you work, that is most of your life, because people put in so many hours. So I think you are right on in realizing that the companies need to change. And I think as the older generation, the people who are retiring, leave the companies and the newer generation comes in, it will just happen almost, just automatically, because that is how they feel. And teamwork is so important. Here's my question. I also know that I am part of that generation that had the performance reviews, and I was a teacher, so I had a performance review, and I had one by a co-teacher and one by the administration, who knew nothing about me as a teacher, and they're the ones who chose the salary, etc. And so I agree with you that the hierarchical doesn't work if someone doesn't know you to do it, and they do it based on other things. They do it on some other people's reports, etc. But at the same time, I do believe that each individual member of a team, in a team or not in a team, I think that they really look forward to, in a sense, even if they fear it, they feel it is a necessary part of their yearly work structure, is that they do get a review. They want to know how they personally, individually are doing. So I agree with the intrinsic rewards and all of those things, but I think there has to be something set up that's a one-on-one or reward, an evaluation, even if it, just evaluate how you are doing as a member of the team or whatever. What do you think? Do you see that as part of
No.
Why?
No, I do see that. And I think these new performance management systems tend to spread the net wider. So they try and get people feedback from other people on the team, peer reviews, as well as from other managers they may interact with in other functional groups. It's really broadening, I think, the feedback loop, then make it, when the old days where it basically was your manager and you. So that feedback in some of these software systems get fed back to the manager, who then can kind of put them together. But there is a move to try and definitely, the feedback is important, without a question. It's also part of a question of not having it just one person's feedback, but trying to make it a little broader. Because, one person may have a bias of sorts, and it's good to try and get around that a bit. The other thing I would say is one of the, I think, issues that has come up with this whole thing about working from home is, where do you draw the line between work, right? If you're always at home, it's a lot harder to say, work stops at 5 p.m. and I'm not going to answer emails while I, deal with my kids' schoolwork or whatever.
Yeah,
Dave?
so just to jump in on that a little bit.
Wait. Okay, people have asked questions on this list, so we're going to ask some of them first. And then if you're going to ask a question, I know everyone's from Antioch and we have a certain style, but ask an actual question. All right.
Oh, okay.
If you know what I mean, maybe you don't.
Yes,
Okay.
we do.
Okay, good. All right. So Roger Huff asked, how do the principles presented vary between manufacturing versus service businesses? And someone else also asked the same thing. I mean, do these changes apply all over the economy, or just to specific sections like tech or the gig economy, or what?
I think, I mean, great, the world has become more service economy than factory. But I think even in factory, you can see some of these things sort of play. Like, if you go back to the early days of Toyota and, American car manufacturers going on to Japan and being amazed at the fact that, somebody on the Japanese assembly line could stop it because they saw a quality issue that they wanted to have dealt with. That was shocking to American manufacturers. But I think that some of those kind of things, a lot of times people on the line know a lot better what's going on than the managers do and can probably improve things considerably themselves. And I think also that what was sort of the quality movement of trying to, kind of replicate the Japanese quality control processes and what have you that American manufactured to try to incorporate, like Xerox had a big deal on QA kind of stuff. I think those are sort of a little bit theory-y-ish.
What about, how do you see the current pandemic affecting these changes? And that's related to another question, was about the $600 unemployment benefits, which had people deciding they would rather get the benefits than going to work. And how does that fit into your whole idea?
That's really two different questions. Yeah. Okay. I think on the pandemic, the old line was the managers had to kind of there's a couple things there. There's one, sort of the micromanagement thing where you walk around to see that people are actually working and not, like in the old days, we worried about people surfing the internet instead of doing their work when they had a computer and internet access. Kind of getting away from that to the fact that if most people are working from home now, you can't actually, there are software programs that will allow you to see if they're really sitting in front of their computer working. But probably more appropriate is people are being judged on their work product now more than their work time, if you will. And so that's a change that I think is along these lines that I would expect. There's probably some other things that I can't think of right off the top of my head, but the pandemic has definitely accelerated some of this shift of responsibility to the individual versus the manager kind of watching over people. And I think it's also accelerated this team approach to things that, managers actually have to make a point to check in with their people now for things when the people are probably doing more team-based coordination from very remote areas particularly. As far as the $600 goes, I think that's more of a philosophical question of whether you think people really are not working because they're getting $600 a week, or whether it's that the jobs just aren't there to start with, and you got to try and keep the economy going by pumping some money out there where people are actually spending.
That's a claim.
I had a question that I couldn't get on the thing, but how does education figure into this, into creating? You really need to create a new kind of workforce, I would think, to be in these kinds of organizations that a lot of people might feel very uncomfortable in. So what do you think education would have to do to create those kinds of workers and managers?
I think you just need to go to liberal arts education, like in Antioch College. But seriously, get to that. There's a couple studies that I saw when I was sort of doing my research, talking about the direction of education going forward. And a lot of it was geared towards trying to help students develop critical thinking, analytical thinking skills, complex reasoning skills, things that are not knowledge of, learn this now and it'll do you good for the rest of your life, because things are changing so fast that it's really adaptability and the critical thinking, and it's going to be important versus acquisition of knowledge. And so like there have been a couple commissions that have talked about going that direction, and when you survey CEOs, those are the kind of things they're starting to say that they're looking for. And schools presumably will respond to, you know, the demand from the people who are going to hire their students in the end.
But what about at the high school level or a younger level than being in college?
I mean, I think it has to filter, you know, all the way down. Mia, you know, a comment on that? A school teacher there?
School teacher, I know, but I think that I think to really as a school teacher, what people really want to do is just to encourage their kids. I mean, I did go to Antioch, so I want students to be lifelong learners, right? And that's really my goal. I want them to be eager and curious and engaged members of the world, you know, just people living on the planet. So it hardly matters. Yes, I think education is important. And one reason I think education is important is because there are many parents who really are not educators. They are not educators of their children. I've had some parents who kind of feel as though they just have this housemate, you know, that's going to be there till 18. I mean, but there are others who are very engaged. But I think you need educators who really are going to bring forward the best in our youth. So I can't see education really going to online. I just get furious, and it makes me sick at the whole situation. I mean, not that anyone can really change it right now, but to figure out how you could have human contact with children it's got to be essential. I just don't, you know, I'm sure other people have comments on that.
Emily, can I speak for a second?
Wait, who's that?
This is John Middleman.
Okay. Can you just wait a second, John, for another
Okay,
question?
sure.
All right.
I was just responding to Emily.
Yeah, okay. Well, someone had asked, do you think Culture Y is better for workers, or are you just saying it's more efficient and inevitable?
Oh, I think it's much better for workers. And I think, you know, given the choice between having more control over your workplace versus less control, I think, you know, studies have shown that employee engagement is an important thing to a company, but also to the individuals who are so-called engaged. You'd much rather go to a job where you're excited about going and you can see your sense of accomplishment versus one where you can't. So no, I mean, I don't think it's just an efficiency kind of thing. I think people will be much happier in that situation. And, you know, and some people also talk about AI taking over the routine, boring kind of tasks and leaving people to do the kind of complex problem solving and the interaction, communication, and essentially creativity side of work. And that should be a positive thing, and I think so too. On the education thing, I just want to add, this is kind of an interesting comment. And Larry Page, who started Google, both were brought up with Montessori schools.
That's right.
Which may mean something to why Google became Google.
Yeah, John, John Middleman, did you want to make your comment? And then we'll just open it up, and if you raise your hands, you know.
Right.
David can call on you.
Well, the question for David was, I was wondering if specifically if he's run into examples of methods of rewarding teams for accomplishing goals. Our company, I work for a very large company, and it's been evolving. But they do individual development plans and still reward people on an annual basis. And to Emily's point, I agree completely that yes, you look forward to that ability to tell you, you know, how you're doing, and you know that is very important. And but more to the education point that Emily was raising and the questions, I think she he's raised some very interesting points about the need for education going on. And my volunteer work is with First Robotics, and we work with a model of mentoring. And I think that is, well, mentoring comes from many different angles, whether it's the teacher specifically involved, or we all learned that at Antioch. That was a big part of Antioch, of our education of co-ops, of the mentors that influenced us as we grew. And I think this is the educational model that we need to promulgate going forward. So I'll just leave it at that, but ask David about the group rewards. I hadn't heard anything on the corporate level.
I've been looking, and I haven't really seen any good examples of that, except the one thing is there is a software company that's fairly new, and their corner on the market has to do with, rather than companies giving monetary rewards, they're into designing experiences for companies. So, instead of, giving you $100 bonus or something like that, you get tickets to the ball game or something like that. And I think you could modify that to work for teams. One of their kind of marketing ploys is, the nice thing about giving experiences is if you give money, people, they enjoy it when you get it, and then kind of they'll spend it or whatever. And with an experience, you can make that a much more rounded kind of benefit, in that people have the anticipation of being able to do the event. They get the enjoyment of the event, and then they get to share it on Insta or whatever afterwards. And so it's a much more kind of fulfilling reward than giving somebody $100 that they'll then tend to forget later. I think that would be very amenable to a group kind of reward kind of thing.
What about women working in teams, or minorities working in teams? Is that a better way for, I know women who would just be awful in a team that had large, loud men talking all the time. They would just shut up. And I wonder how you work with teams or minorities who feel they're a minority on the team. So how do you deal with that?
I think, a lot of that is training of the team leader. And what I've seen, that part of the thing of companies that are trying to handle inclusion as well as diversity is what they find is they'll hire minorities, and then after a year or two, the minorities will leave because they don't feel like they're part of the discussion. And so I think you end up having to go through very conscious training for leaders to ensure that everyone gets a voice, and that everyone's recognized, and you particularly pay attention to people who normally don't give a voice. And that's, I think, how you deal with it. But it requires training that I think most, team people don't really have yet. Because it needs an awareness of unconscious. Mm-hmm.
Of unconscious bias, yeah. Do any of you have questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask David. Kathy, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I actually put on the chat dealing with the health and medical field, and I came out of public health. I also worked in hospitals and in academic health, medical centers, and taught at the graduate level. And it's my observation, at least, aren't people in this field, which happens to be today, one of the largest percentages of our gross national product. They're following both theory X and theory Y principles, depending on whether they give direct patient care. And it's very interesting to me, and I'm wondering what you think about this. If they're doing direct patient care, they're starting to work and are working in teams and more. If they're not, and they're more in academic settings or out in the real world, it's everything for over 100 years revolved around the hierarchical model. So I'm wondering what you think about this, because education of health workers is a huge field today, as is the labor market.
Mhm.
So I'm
I
wondering whether you think they're doing theory X and Y, or where are they moving to?
guess I would default back to say, how subject are they to the trends that I sort of enumerated in the beginning of the conversation? If they're not that affected by all those kinds of things, then, you know, they're probably not changing, and they're probably just following sort of the historical, you know, process. But to the extent that they're going to be more affected by technology, by generational change and things like that, then I think they will probably start to evolve, would be my guess.
Okay, because I'll tell you what, when I had my first Antioch co-op job, and this was in 1962, was in a hospital in Philadelphia that was physical rehab, had a rehab, separate rehab unit. And I was just a lowly aide, pushing people in a wheelchair from their hospital rooms to physical therapy and to the rehab center. And I was considered part of the team. Once a week, everybody on the team had to discuss a patient's case situation. And that's where I learned about team building all the way back then. But those folks were pioneers in that field. Today, I think the move is towards a team approach when it relates to patient care, as opposed to, and then doctors are having to be re-educated that they are not the center of the universe, even though they have a medical license and, you know, and are one of the few people who can prescribe medications. In fact, the nursing profession has grown in this direction. But there's still this hierarchical thing when it comes to the academic side.
Mm-hmm.
So,
You know, one of the things there is one of the applications for artificial intelligence that I was reading about has to do with, you know, reading MRIs and things, that you run enough MRIs through a computer and it's going to spot stuff that the doctor, you know, who normally, radiologist, whoever normally looks at those things might not pick up. Or it'll be able to handle, the computer will be able to handle kind of routine stuff, and then something that looks really out of the way, you know, gets referred to the radiologist to take a look at. So I don't know, even doctors to some extent, I think, are going to be affected by some of these things. I'm not sure how that'll affect the hierarchy, but.
well, one of the things that's affecting it is this field is almost overwhelmingly female at this point. The more women are in medicine, a majority now are entering the field, and the nursing profession and other, you know, allied health professions.
Yeah, Kathy,
I'm not finished, but I think women are changing this.
yeah, we're running way out, sort of over our time here, unless anybody else has any specific questions for David.
There were a lot of questions on the chat that came up earlier.
I know, I saw those.
So those weren't, okay.
You want me to run through them? Or?
Yeah. I mean, if you had questions on the chat that weren't covered, feel free to raise them now, yeah. But if you don't, then we will wind up this meeting. So did anyone have any more questions? Yeah, Roger?
Yes, David, I'd be very interested in your comments with respect to how unions fit into this thinking that you have.
Is there such a thing?
You know, I think it probably depends on the union, you know, what union you're talking about, I suspect, because I think it's going to be job dependent. So if you're talking about a, you know, hotel workers union, it's probably going to be different than, you know, United Auto Workers at General Motors. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that right off the top. I mean, I think you'd like to see all jobs sort of merge to or I would like to see most jobs merge to a theory Y kind of thing. So, but I haven't thought about specifically where unions might fit into that specifically. I mean, to the extent that it provides more responsibility to the individuals, then I think it's probably a plus on the union side.
Okay, thanks.
David, I suggested in the chat room a name for your book. It's called Rugged Teamism, The Demise of Rugged Individualism.
I like that. Okay. All right.
Business apocalypse, but
You can take it under advisement.
Yes.
So are we done with questions? Sarah, you had a question. Do you want to ask it, or are you there? No.
I'm
He's
here.
disappeared.
Well, I was just curious about the rise in non-white in non-white workforce participants, because it seems to me that, for example, the Black population isn't really changing in terms of percentage of the population, and yet their participation is more. And I was wondering, what's contributing to that? Is that sensitivity training? Is that are they better educated now? I don't just mean Blacks. I'm using the Black population because I know that stays about stable. And if the percentage is the same and not changing, where the heck were they before, and what were they doing?
good question. And I actually don't know the answer to that as it relates to Blacks. I will say that the increase in minority participation in the labor force is being driven mostly by Hispanics and larger births there.
Okay, so that's a population that is growing.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. All right.
Okay, well, Jesse, several people have asked how they could get a recording, and I was wondering, can we send out an email to everyone who participated and somehow figure out how they can get a recording?
I have to figure that out.
Okay. We will figure that out.
We will figure that out. And I made a copy of the chat comments so that I have a record of who asked for copies. And
Good.
yeah. Oh, but I have a question too. I was interested, David, in the fact that it's 140 to 100 women to 100 men with college degrees and all the way up. And so what do you think that's, I definitely know that women work differently than men. And what do you think that that does for the workplace?
There's so much bias in the workplace that I'm hoping that it will sort of counter some of that bias. The interesting thing is, along with the fact that so many more women are getting college degrees of one level or another compared to men, is also that the fields with the highest growth of workers is healthcare, for example, which,
Yes. Yeah.
And the fields which are predominantly women, or at least have a very high percentage of participation by women. And the fields that are declining, which are like manufacturing and mining, tend to be more male oriented. So it's interesting. I think the push in companies now to kind of get more diversity, not only racially, but gender, and move it up the ranks. There's some interesting things there. So if I look at Salesforce as an example, Mark Benioff, when they were when they were looking at meetings that they were having, and he'd look around at some of the senior level meetings, and he would say, it's almost all men. Why aren't there any women here? And they would basically say, well, we don't have any women at that level. He imposed a rule that basically said, you know what, if we don't have it at that level, then go down to the next, reach down to the next level where there are women and bring them up to that meeting so they can participate. So it was an attempt to sort of balance out the fact that they didn't have a high number of women up in the senior level places, and he could start training women to, take those roles. So if you start seeing some of those kind of things, I think that's a good thing in the workplace. And I think, some people are starting to see that happen. What was your question? Before I got off.
Just how the change in the education demographics affects the workplace. And of course, the next thing to change is the racial makeup of the educational demographics.
I have a comment, and that is that I think that we should take the claim that people would rather have the stimulus payment than work with a grain of salt. I have been reading some research. I don't know how good the research is, and it seems as if the people who are getting the stimulus checks go back to work at the same rate as people who are not getting the stimulus checks. So there's a political benefit to some people in saying that people are refraining from going back to work if they're getting the stimulus checks. And that's the argument that's being made by the Republicans in the Senate right now. So I'm not really sure that that's true. So I'm urging us not to repeat that argument because it may not be true.
I've heard the same thing, and also if you're invited back to work, you can no longer collect unemployment.
That's right.
So.
But even with, I think if you've got to go back to a full-time job, that's, you figure it's going to last longer than your $600 a week kind of payment. My guess is you go back to the job, Yeah. I'd make that trip, but
I think they're talking about lower level workers being reluctant to go back to work. There may be some like that, but the evidence, I haven't seen the evidence. The evidence seems to be go in the other direction.
Some of the workers at the lower levels are afraid to go back to work, according to some commentaries that I've heard. They don't want to get sick. The other people, they also have families to take care of who are sick, like older folks, etc. So there's a mixed bag there, and Joan's right. I don't think there's enough
Supervision. School children at home need supervision.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it seems like a political argument that we shouldn't necessarily believe, that people are ready to go back because they would rather earn the money by sitting.
Well, they'd rather also, if they get benefits, receive health insurance.
Yes.
I'm sorry, David, did you want to say something? David Southern, did you want to say something?
Big question, yeah.